Since 1980, Nadine Bloch has worked as an organizer, participant, and coordinator of creative, nonviolent direct action campaigns, both locally and internationally, marine and land-based. She has delivered hundreds of innovative workshops on protest arts, from active nonviolence tactics and skills to giant puppet fabrication and earned media, as well as in organizational development, decision-making, strategic planning, and facilitation and community building. With degrees in environmental studies and politics, as well as fine arts, and many years as a formal and informal educator, Nadine has worked with diverse organizations including Nonviolence International, Greenpeace, the Ruckus Society, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the National Organization of Women, Business Leaders for Sensible Priorities, Conservation International, the Labor Heritage Foundation, Health GAP, Housing Works, American Friends Service Committee, Empowering Democracy, and the Bread and Puppet Theater. Her work has been featured nationally and locally, including in the Washington Post, Cornell Alumni Magazine, MS Magazine, and on CNN Time. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Nadine Bloch.
Thanks so much, Jake. I assume that this is reading okay? Is that correct?
Yeah, the audio sounds good.
Great. So thanks. I just will start by saying thank you for inviting me to do this webinar to ICNC, and also thanks to Chelsea Cohn, who's an intern who's been working with me this summer on some of the work around cultural resistance. So just as a way to start, I come from an activist and an arts background, and I have been perhaps an artist before I was an activist, but always an organizer. And my background is specifically in printmaking, puppetry, stilt walking, and painting. So a lot of the work that I do falls into the category of helping activist groups harness the power of creative resistance to be more effective in getting their messages heard, and then, of course, in achieving our goals. And I advocate the use of arts and cultural work, creative nonviolent resistance, because I believe it's at the core a way of reclaiming our humanity and of celebrating our worth as individuals and communities. And in this way, it's the antithesis of corporate domination of the mainstream culture that sells homogenized consumption, all at the cost of the loss of our quality of life, of our human rights, our individual potential, and what I consider true security, our ability to exercise agency over our lives, our schools, our communities, and beyond. So I find that encouraging cultural expression inspires people to own their lives, invest in their communities, all the while building capacity for local leadership. And of course, it provides a way to have fun while doing all this hard work. So just a little bit of a disclaimer in that, in general, I don't lecture, but because I believe in an interactive form of learning, because I believe it's much more empowering and effective in educational settings. But I do want to take advantage of this technology of the webinar, so I'm delighted to have this opportunity to work with you in this way, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions and comments at the end. So let's start sort of at the beginning. What is cultural resistance? Basically, it's a field that's been explored only in bits by different people, and when I look at it, I'm broadly looking at the use of arts, literature, and traditional practices to challenge or fight unjust or oppressive systems and our power holders within the context of nonviolent actions, campaigns, and movements. And why bother studying it? I guess that's probably the next question. And I think the real reason is to broaden the understanding of the use of cultural resistance within civil resistance. And in that way, to identify and analyze the strategic functions of cultural resistance. And we hope the outcome will be from this work that we can increase the capacity and effectiveness of the use of cultural activities and arts in organizing, mobilizing, and then, of course, in accomplishing nonviolent direct actions. And I really believe, from my perspective and my work so far, the integration of art and culture back into one's life is a way to give people back their agency, their ability to do things and affect change. And we find, as in environmental or ecological systems, diversity is the key to sustainability. We find also in cultural work that the diversity of cultural work that's open to us is one of the big strengths of integrating this work into our nonviolent direct action. So for those of you who like to categorize things, I've made an effort, and with others, to put cultural resistance work into 12 big categories. And there could be a lot of give and take around these identification of these categories, definitely. But we'll start off working within this framework so we have a way to talk to each other, at least in this next 40 minutes. So we look, of course, at 2D arts, 3D arts, sound, music, theater, movement, dance. Those things are probably obvious to everyone, as probably is traditional crafts, language preservation, literature, and writing. Some of the others maybe cause you to think, does this really belong in cultural resistance work? Under media and documentation, we're going to look at everything from whistleblowing to radio and video production. Delineation of space is the actual identification of a place or the designation of a zone that would be free of war or free of weapons. Traditional rituals can span everything from funerals to birthday parties. And then finally, the more long-term work of cultural institution building. So really quickly, we're going to run through some images. And I apologize, this format does not lend itself to having video or music accompany it. But of course, that would be one of the benefits of studying cultural work, is to have all of that incorporated into this. But we'll go with the 2D representations at the moment. So here we have 2D art. I've selected some things from ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, work that's from the 1980s, and from Otpor's protest work in Serbia. They used stenciling and stickers exhaustively to make the authorities believe, especially early on, that they were everywhere and a massive number of people when they were just starting up. And you might notice that 2D art doesn't actually have to be stationary, right? This was quite a renegade bus advertisement when it was put on the buses in the 1980s. 3D art, maybe something you would think about would be giant puppets or sculptures. Here we have gigantonas from Nicaragua telling the story of the Spanish occupation. And we also have people lined up on the beach spelling out and filling in a design, a Picasso design, talking about endangered freedoms from Greenpeace action in Florida in 2004. Some examples from that. There's plenty of examples all over the world, and we'll talk about some of them using sound and music. I include poetry, spoken word specifically in this category. We have the Plastic People of the Universe, very revolutionary, if you will, Czech, these rock and rollers. And of course, we have the ever-present drums from many, many cultures and many protests. And particularly in Africa, this Somali picture points out, is the use of oral traditions. I have cultural history telling as well as oral traditions to move people to action. So it's a very, very big thing in some parts of the world. Of course, theater can span everything from traditional, on the stage, professionally produced theater to in the street theater groups, and other things you may or may not identify as identity correction. That's the yes men's role in actually performing what they think people should be doing in the roles that they have as, say, ExxonMobil shareholders or directors of Union Carbide Corporation. Movement and dance. We see all over the world some interesting things around movement and dance. And in particular, in this section, I include everything from the clandestine insurgent rebel clown army, you can see them hugging a policeman in the lower corner, to dances in parts of the world that were specifically designed to tell stories or to encourage a certain transfer of information, like La Bamba in Puerto Rico, or other works, particularly integrating some martial arts. And we can see one of the most famous marches, or a picture from India in the 1930s, has set the stage for many, many movement actions in the future, and continues to this day. Media and documentation. So we're talking about production of video, radio, film, archives, and even whistleblowing. We have a phenomenon globally called indie media. Many of you are probably aware of this, where people are insisting that if you don't like the news, make your own, go out and document. And particularly in this day and age with accessibility of Twitter and Facebook and all the other ways, YouTube and all the other ways of getting information out there, certainly people do this without attention to detail, without making it an art, but the conscious use of this kind of work can serve campaigns effectively and serve as a cultural, when based in a culture, can serve as a very effective way to move the resistance. And we have, of course, traditional crafts, and we'll talk a little bit about some of these things, everything from spinning fabric to traditional food and the process or the rituals involved with making the food and traditional dress. Language preservation is a big piece of work, and actually for many cultures the actual act of preserving their language is in and of itself their act of resistance. And where these things overlap in particular makes things very meaningful across the board. We see this in First Nations and Indigenous peoples and peoples threatened by occupation in many parts of the world. Literature and writing. So on this page there's quite a diversity of things on this page. Of course there are plenty of books that have been written, and there's always pamphlets and documents that are produced by campaigns. Some are more artistic than others. Some are based more in cultural work than others. The White Rose Collective in Germany was a group of young people who produced basically broadsides against the Nazi government and were executed for that. And below you can see on the other side completely a spoof done of the New York Times by the Yes Men in New York City to make people think about what it would be like if the war was really ended. And there's many ways of using writing and literature to promote your campaigns. Delineation of space. So as I'm working on these projects, people have suggested to me different categories for looking at how cultural work is integrated into civil resistance. And in particular, there are peace villages in many places in the world and nuclear-free weapon zones in others. And I will point out the one on the left-hand lower corner, of Parking Day. You can see that a group of people have actually reclaimed a parking space to turn it into a park for a day, with a big statement on how public space is used and the reclamation of public space in our car-driven or car-centric lives here in the United States. We also take a look at traditional rituals and celebrations. So the bottom picture is the actual funeral from an ACT UP member, Steve Michael, in front of the White House. You might recognize that building. And the picture above is a Seder plate from the Jewish tradition of Passover. And the Seder plate has been transformed by some communities into a way to talk about those people who are not represented at the table in this conversation about overcoming oppression and liberation. So the orange is there to represent women, and the olives are there to represent the olive harvest in Palestine, which is under occupation from Israel. And finally, we'll look at cultural institution building. So altogether, a lot of this work can happen within certain short-lived campaigns or certain movements. There are also times when there's a big investment in the community into a long-standing or a continuation of their desire to teach their traditions, their languages, and to keep the culturals alive, the cultural traditions alive. So we do see a lot of cultural institution building in many places in communities that are in resistance. So we're going to take a quick look now at a few cultural resistance examples from several places around the globe. And we'll see how the time goes, how far we get with this list, but I'll definitely get to most of them. So right here we see, this is an arpillera from Chile. And basically, arpilleras are three-dimensional applique textiles of Chilean tradition. And they are made by taking pieces of cloth or rag and appliquing them on. A lot of times they're not two-dimensional, they're three-dimensional, and they even sometimes include messages in them. And you can see from here, this is a very political statement, very beautiful, very political, with question marks on bodies of people who are in the hills. And you might know, if you start thinking about Chile or other Central and Southern American struggles, arts and cultural work played a huge role. Everything from song and the Nueva Canción movement to lots of art, and particularly dancing and other things, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. And when we look at song, for example, I didn't want to just totally gloss over it. When Salvador Allende actually took office, he stood in front of a banner that said, "You can't have a revolution without songs." Of course, in 1973, by the time Pinochet was in power, he outlawed many of the Andean instruments that were critical in keeping this song tradition alive. And he didn't manage to kill it, of course, but it was definitely his attempt to try and shut that movement down. And my particular interest in looking at these RPRs is to look at how the women's movement, or I should say not the women's movement, but women were involved in the resistance movement against Pinochet. And through this craft, women were critical in getting the message about what was actually happening out to the rest of the world and providing an income both for themselves and their families in these tough times and for raising money for the resistance movements, because these things were smuggled out, sometimes with notes to people who would denounce what was happening at a national or an international level, and people who could act on behalf in either assisting the Chilean community or sending them money or passing on messages to other folks. And it's interesting because a lot of these RPRs were sort of disregarded in the early days because it was just considered women's work. It was sewing, inconsequential women's work. And the women, in the process of gathering to make these things, would find a safe space in which to discuss the democracy, or lack thereof, the dictatorship, I should say, and the lack of democracy, and would often find the courage to move from making these crafts into actual public action together. And furthermore, one of the public actions that they moved into is known as La Cueca Sola, which is a traditional courtship dance, but when they danced it alone, under its sola, it became a symbol of the women's struggle against the dictatorship. And it was a way, the women's involvement in the resistance movement was benefit. What should I say? The women's involvement came from their ability to enter at this level of craft and at this level of dance that they were familiar with. And so what we find in the benefits of this cultural resistance work of making RPRs and integrating La Cueca Sola into protest is that they found themselves that they had it was just not simply preserving the collective memory itself, which was an act of protest, but creating the RPRs also empowered the women in other ways. They realized what was happening wasn't just their own issue, and they could join with others and become involved in other protests. They found that they had a way to make money, and it also was a way of cognitive liberation, if you will, that allowed them to begin to confront machismo in their own homes and in the society in general. So it had a really big impact in the movement, I should say, on the movement. We're going to shift gears and take a little look at Palestine. And again, Palestine is a place where over the 40 years of occupation, more than 40 years of occupation by the Israelis of Palestinian territories, many different forms of cultural resistance have been used. The use of their flags and traditional colors, traditional dress, song, hip-hop, olive tree farming, graffiti, cultural institution building, theater development. And what we find is that particularly in work where this occupation was demoralizing, the work of using cultural resistance techniques allowed for outlets for individual expression and creativity. It encouraged tools for critical thinking and communication, and it really built a sense of empowerment, self-confidence, and hope within the communities that were under this oppression. And this served in turn to inspire unity, mobilize people to resist the occupation, and recognize that they were not alone in this work. And it also helped to engage people to keep a nonviolent presence. It was more likely if you were engaged in some of these activities that you would have a unity in your commitment to nonviolent action. And it was very critical for this group that the resistance included the process of building healthy and effective individuals and communities. And that is really part of maintaining a rich culture, that a rich culture helps to maintain people who can develop socially, politically, and economically the infrastructure that's needed to have a community that functions in the long haul. And in particular, there was also an economic component, like we saw with the alqueras, in that with the olive harvest, the defense of olive groves, the participation in that was not only economically critical, but it was critical to the cultural history of the Palestinians as well. And this continues on. Oh yes, I wanted to share one other piece from this. There's been an incredible use of graffiti on the wall that's been built by the Israelis, the separation wall. And here we have 4 images that were done by a well-known graffiti artist, not a Palestinian, but Banksy, in 2005. And he integrates not only traditional graffiti techniques, but the elements of humor and the understanding that there is another world outside of the wall. And these are very effective, and you can imagine they were very insightful in more than one way. I'm going to take a moment and look at India. And, you know, everybody probably is aware of all of the work that's happened in India, particularly around the Salt Satyagraha and the homespun campaigns in 1930, 1931 for the Salt March. But I wanted to point it out because the Padayatra, or the word for a long spiritual march, really became a model for strategic action for many social movements since then. And the brilliance of selecting the salt as the commodity to make can't be underestimated. Gandhi was a very brilliant strategist, and salt was not only necessary in the daily diet, particularly in this country because, you know, it's a tropical country, but it affected all the classes. And so the struggle in India was not only against the oppressors, but also within to release people from the class system. And it affected the tax on the salt, of course, affected the poorest Indians the most. It was a real, actual thing that they could do, not just a pie-in-the-sky wish for more political representation. And so it gave everyone a chance to act courageously, and which goes the same for spinning of the cloth as well. And in the process, it really undermined the machinery of the British Empire. It did, you know, somewhat affect their economy, but mostly within the community of India itself, the country of India itself, for Indians, it had profound cultural resonance. It also attracted worldwide attention, united the people. It exposed the Brits' facade of civility and how they responded to the march and the brutal beatings and killings. And within the march and within the taking on of making your own salt or making your own cloth, it modeled a new social order and a vision for how things could be if the Indians themselves were in charge. It also provided, the march itself provided a captive audience and a wide audience to pay attention to the teachings that Gandhi was interested in getting out there. And again, it wasn't just this making of the salt and spinning of the cloth that was important. There was drama and music and dance, drumming, all integrated into this work, and it was very conscious to promote this constructive work while promoting the native crafts and the traditions of encouraging people to believe in their culture and to believe in themselves and increase their self-reliance. And so that's just one of the more clear benefit examples of using cultural resistance. Take a look now at Indonesia and shadow puppets. This is a story of how artists have taken traditional forms of art and brought them into present-day use, made them topical. So at the top of this slide, you can see some current-day shadow puppets. These are by a group called Taring Padi, the name of which means fangs of rice, or teeth of rice, which they believe is a metaphor for people power. And the most interesting thing is that they updated this way of using shadow puppets, and they subverted the old school wayang, or the conventions of it, where normally the people, the grassroots people, are portrayed as bungling clowns or unrefined and crude. And in contrast, they now portray positive realist images of the people who are actually wise to the deceptions of the rulers, and the power holders, who are of course normally characterized by their refined features, are depicted often as beast-like creatures resembling pigs or wolves. You can see some of that in the modern day puppets. And so this actually serves to validate cultural history and to upgrade it and to make people proud of their heritage and able to use it in modern day situations. This group, Taryn Pagi, also was involved in other forms of artwork. They produced incredibly beautiful woodcut prints, and in particular, they did a lot of this dissemination of woodcut prints to actually promote ideas of conflict resolution and getting along with each other to lower heightened unrest before elections that were happening in June 1999. So they were trying to circumvent a civil war. And these messages promoted solidarity, peaceful social interrelations. In fact, the one on the right basically says, love your neighbor, the one with that heart. And the one on the left says, problems cannot be solved with weapons. And they were in a long-standing tradition before Suharto came to power in 1965, the tradition of the people-oriented culture, or the Seni Kerakyatan, was a loose term that referred to this. This artist's social commitment was popular before Suharto came to power in 65. And when he left in 1998, these folks and others stepped back into that traditional role of artist agitators. All right, let's move over to the United States for a quick look. And really quickly, I'll talk about the feminist art movement. And the feminist art movement to me is fascinating because it was one of the first uses of cutting-edge public relation techniques, graphics, consciously subverting the dominant culture, creating alternative institutions in space, and subverting rituals, and making sure that craft moved into the realm occupied by high art. And we're running out of time here, but I'll just point out that Woman House was an art house that was part of the California State University, and it was started by women, for women, and they created this whole way of working together and promoting art. The bottom picture is the dinner party by Judy Chicago, also very avant-garde about promoting women and women's ideas through the use of art. And in 1970, for example, when there was an annual exhibit at the Whitney Art Museum in New York, there were only 5% of the exhibit artists were men. By the time they were done picketing and projecting women's images via slides on the outside of the building and leaving other things inside the museum over a 2-month campaign period, they had won 22% of the artists exhibited the next year were actually women. So there were significant changes, and I think that over the years of the, let's say the 30 years where the feminist art movement was really active, it was a place that challenged the status quo, announced and gathered the community to do this work, because people didn't know that others were out there, reclaimed the art world, and provided space for artists to run their own galleries and move this dialogue about women's rights from the art world into the national dialogue. And really quickly, we'll look at some humorous takes on the feminist world, or I should say the art world in general. A group called the Gorilla Girls used humor, which basically upended the notion that feminists don't have a sense of humor, and merged them with actual facts and figures, very, very blunt and to the point. And so these were very effective ways of using the art culture that the feminist movement artists operated in and bring it into the mainstream and attacking the art establishment itself. So let's take it. We'll move now all the way over to South Africa. I couldn't actually do a talk about cultural resistance without including South Africa. Most of you, I'm sure, are aware of the phenomenal soundtrack to the movement, the long soundtrack to the long movement in South Africa, struggle for rights in South Africa. But there were also other pieces of cultural work that were involved. So the Toi Toi is the military march dance and a song style that became commonplace in massive street demonstration. And as one activist put it, the Toi Toi was our weapon. We didn't have the technology of warfare, the tear gas and tanks, but we had this weapon. And in fact, many people were quoted, many authorities were quoted as being scared or intimidated by the massive marching and chanting groups of people who would occupy and resist the force in South Africa. And the lower shot is a funeral procession. Again, like with the AIDS protests, the funerals were real funerals that were used in the political moment to highlight the death that was a part of the resistance movement itself. And so these acts of unity basically brought courage to the community and helped with adherence to nonviolence guidelines, drew masses of people, moved masses of people to action, increased their commitment, built camaraderie within the groups that were working, and gave the communities feelings of power, and while at the same time serving to undermine the power that the authorities tried to use over them. And while we're talking, I just mentioned the song in South Africa, I will also mention Estonia, because Estonia is also known as the Singing Revolution. So from 1986 to 1991, and previously in the 13th and 18th century, Estonia had an incredible tradition of folk songs. In fact, I think Estonia has one of the world's largest repertoires of folk songs, and they've used their music as political weapons for centuries. And in particular, in 1988, there was a massive song festival in town that brought in about a quarter of all the Estonians. So 300,000 Estonians was about the quarter of the population then. And this served both to open their eyes to the massive numbers of people within their country that were interested in resisting. It was very difficult for the authorities to shut down, since it was a mass nonviolent singing, and it served to help people reconnect and recommit to the work that they were doing, delegitimize the control of the regime, diffuse the response of the regime, and provided a vision for the future while they were within this great exhibition of unity. And I'll also mention that in Estonia, the flag, the blue, black, and white flag, was outlawed by the Russians, by the Soviets. And before they were bold enough to fly the flag as one, they would take strips of blue, black, and white fabric and wave them together, thereby creating the flag without risking the legal ramifications of having an actual flag. And you'll see when you look at many revolutions or cultural resistance campaigns, you'll see the use of colors for identification of participants, for memory, for the coordination of actions. Just wanted to point out that we see this with Estonia as well. So as a way of tying up this presentation, I just wanted to highlight what I think are sort of 5 big categories of strategic function for cultural resistance. So cultural resistance can motivate, it can promote group function, develop cause consciousness, and it also creates space and serves as itself as a constructive program. I'll go back to this other slide. So just really quickly, one of the most important things about ensuring people join your movement is being able to articulate why you're doing what you're doing. So articulating a vision, providing psychological and emotional support, and offering a framework for people to commit to. And this is all on an individual basis. And then within the group, we need the same thing. We need to build the group identity, create a container for consciousness raising and self-recognition, something that will establish the culture and the values of the group itself and encourage unity. Cultural resistance, perhaps, is the best form of education, and so it increases the effectiveness of internal and external education. It expands the potential for discourse while concurrently undermining control of authorities. And we see, too, that it helps to create space in that it provides practice for organizing how to run your democracy if you just have to run an art space or a choral group. And it also gives you a place to have these conversations that are not necessarily obvious to the authorities. So it reduces the risks that you take often. And they can serve as constructive programs. When we see that the cultural work itself, whether it's language preservation or it's schoolwork or owning, making salt, when it can be the direct action itself, this is really where the benefits of using this work as far as reaching out to the masses is greatly seen. And of course, it can provide mechanisms for fundraising, as we've seen. And just as a way of closing, we've seen kind of a really broad overview of the use of cultural resistance. We can see it's not isolated, it's everywhere and widely used. Sometimes it's more effective than others. When the component of resistance overlaps with the preservation or the use of the specific cultural aspects, using the cultural work itself as a resistance action, it is most powerful. When you can walk the talk, you increase the unity of the group, you increase the courage of the group, the pride, and it can expose the designs of the oppressors and the authorities very easily. And what seems to be most important is to turn these implicit processes into explicit knowledge, because they're likely to be more effective and more successful. So my recommendation, coming out of looking at some of this, is to help groups do strategic cultural assessment alongside other assessments when you're doing strategic planning. Look at the resources within your group and the cultural traditions and work within your group that can be harnessed in the service of the civil resistance that you're doing. And doing this, identifying and using the cultural resistance work can improve the tenor and the tone of the campaign, build unity, encourage innovation, and expand the breadth of nonviolent discipline, and therefore can have your campaign be more effective at reaching its goals. So that's it for my piece, and I hope we still have time for questions.
Hi, Nadine. Thank you so much for your presentation. Yeah, we should have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions. And I do know there's kind of an audio discrepancy between my microphone and yours, so I apologize. Unfortunately, there's nothing that we can do about that. So hopefully you can all just bear with us. And as a reminder, you can ask questions one of two ways. If you have a telephone or a computer microphone ready, you can click the raise hand button, and I'll unmute you, and you can go ahead and ask your question that way. And you can also type in a question into the questions pane on your toolbar. So our first question comes from Darren. Darren, please go ahead.
Hi, Nadine. Thanks for a great webinar. My question is, are there examples of how nonviolent movements have used different elements of art that are used by their adversary against them? So I guess, for lack of a better word, using kind of like a regime or a corporation's logo or types of propaganda, and then kind of taking those and alter them to be seen as a form of resistance.
Sure. Yeah, this is a great question. You mean, well, I guess there's two ways to look at it. One is that we, the nonviolent activists, get a hold of their logos, their symbols, and use them against them. Is that the question you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay. So right off the top of my head, actually, in the United States, people, or globally, actually, people would probably recognize the Nike sneaker swoosh. And that has been widely used. They use that swoosh to start a word in English that says basically Nike sucks. And that went wildly around. there's a whole group called Adbusters that takes corporate logos and corporate elements and turns them into anti-corporate statements. I always advocate, in fact, that people use common symbols or common things that are in people's cultures to do work with. So if Santa Claus is part of your culture, you can take Santa Claus and actually ask Santa Claus to bring you, women's rights or a nuclear-free world or whatever it is. So there's been many examples of that in particular. And they're the examples of the yes men who do identity correction and spend a lot of time pretending to be corporate executives and talking about how they're going to right their wrongs and forcing the actual corporate executives to then say, no, that wasn't us. We're not doing that. We're going to still rape and pillage your community. We're not cleaning up. We're not going to save anything. So there's lots of examples where the nonviolent activists have used the corporate images against the corporate or the government campaigns. There are also examples where the governments or the corporations have used art extremely effectively in controlling the population, of course. So, I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, but that's where I would go with it.
Oh, that's great.
All right, our next question comes from William, who asks, when can religious gestures and expressions count as cultural resistance?
Okay. When can religious gestures and expressions? Well, I think, actually it's interesting because it's not just religious gestures and expressions that we have to ask this question for. It's all kinds of art. So I'm going to answer the question rather broadly. So, for example, if the dominant culture is practicing a certain religion, it would be difficult to say that religion or pieces of that religion without significant change would act as a way of resistance. The same, and also if, so what we're looking at, and the same thing is for other kinds of art. So if, for example, there's a rock and roll band that produces one song that's a song of resistance, and they didn't produce it in concert with a movement or at the request of activists, and they themselves are not activists, that song may go on to be useful to a campaign in a cultural resistance framework, but it wasn't necessarily part of a larger plan to utilize cultural resistance within the campaign of resistance. And so I think, a lot of these questions are not answerable. Certainly, I would say nonviolent direct action is not, or the study of civil resistance is not a science. It's an art form. And so to figure out when religious gestures can be expressions of resistance or used as resistance has to be in the context. We see here's a great example of what I consider a religious gesture or spiritual gesture used as a resistance action in Burma. The community, the culture revolves around the Buddhist tradition and the nuns and the priests. And what happens when they were marching, the Buddhist monks, one of the things that they would do, it's a great honor and requirement in the tradition to donate, to give alms to the monks who require support from the people to live. And the Buddhist monks, at some points in the Saffron Revolution, would turn their alms bowls upside down and refuse to take alms from soldiers who were supporting the regime. And so that is a clear act, I'd say, of using the religious, or this cultural religious work and turning it upside down, literally.
The next question comes from Lee. Lee, you're now unmuted. Please go ahead with your question.
Yes. Hi, Nadine. This is a great, important topic. Thanks so much for sharing your experience with this. My question is, are there important ways in which art deals with repression? Are there ways in which art helps deter repression or makes it more likely that repression will backfire on the perpetrators?
Okay. Interesting. I would say using art or cultural work is a way for people to limit or control the amount of repression or kickback that they get. So classic example is stickering or wheat pasting, something you can do in the cover of darkness. You go out and put your stickers up or your pictures up, and hopefully no one catches you. So your message gets out. That goes for graffiti or spray paint or lots of other things, right? And that's a very easy way to think about it. There's ways where in Chile, you know, one of the things that happened in Chile when the repression was terrific, people really weren't able to gather in large groups at certain points, and what they would do is stay in their homes and beat on their pots and pans. So they would use noise, the cacerolosas. So it would just be this massive banging on pots and pans, and by hearing that, you would know that you were not alone, and it was virtually impossible for anyone to crack down on people banging their pots and pans in a kitchen at night. You know, maybe they were just cooking dinner. So there's lots of examples where using the cultural work, the arts, the singing, the graphics can lower your exposure to resistance. If it makes it, I don't know, I can't off the top of my head think about whether it makes it more likely to backfire. I think that when we think about cultural work, we need to be really careful about what we use so that it doesn't backfire. And I'll give you a small example from my life. I worked with Greenpeace for many years, and we in the United States have a giant Christmas tree. They cut down a beautiful old growth tree, and they bring it to the White House every year. And there was a talk about occupying that tree and basically using that cultural tradition as a way to talk about our old growth forests. And it was nixed. The idea was not carried out because the idea was seen as, number one, offensive to people who believe in the traditions in a spiritual, religious way, and number two, overstepping the bounds of what people would actually make our message not get through to people because they would be so angry that we used this opportunity to thwart a happy time, basically, or religious celebration. So I think that there are lots of questions around how cultural work is used to prevent backfire. And I can't think of, maybe other people listening have an example of the backfire question you asked about.
All right, so for the next question, I'm going to combine two of them from Thelma and Mary Lou, who ask, first off, do you consider art cultural resistance a weapon for social change? And if so, where are there any schools or blogs or websites or anything else where people can find out more information about this and learn more about it?
Okay, that's the question. Great. Yes, and yes. I do consider art or cultural resistance as a premier weapon for social change. Definitely something you should have in your toolbox. And there are a lot of interesting places to get information. And I will actually send Jake a list of links to post with the webinar when it gets posted so that you can find them. But in particular, there are resources on the web. There's an organization I work with called the Ruckus Society, which trains people in nonviolent direct action skills as well as creative resistance skills. I work with the group locally in Washington, D.C., WAG, that we do a lot of training and work in helping people be strategically creative. There is a developing website, wagthis.org, and soon there'll be more things up on that website. Bread and puppet theater, for example, if you're interested in giant puppets in theater, there are a lot of us who teach that skill. And Bread and Puppet Theater has internships. They have a website as well. And on and on and on. There are a lot of really exciting potential ways to learn. And in specific, what I would recommend is that keep your eyes and ears open for campaigns and action possibilities that you can join in on. So where I live in Washington, D.C., and I also travel quite a lot to help with mobilizations around specific issues from the environment to human rights to economic rights, there usually are provided many training resources, trainings on giant puppet making, trainings on banner making, et cetera, writing political songs. And so those are specific, those mobilizations offer opportunities to get on-the-ground training while participating in actions themselves.
Next we have Fiem. So Fiem, you're unmuted now. You can go ahead with your question.
Hey Nadine, what if the authorities you are resisting realize you act and decide to clear it by way of legislation or force, because some of them may even storm your residence, so what do you do? Thank you.
Oh my goodness, I had a lot of trouble hearing what you said. Can you try again?
Yes, Nadine, I'm asking that what if the authorities you are resisting realize your act and decide to cure it by way of legislation or force, because some of them may even storm your residence, so what do you do?
Yes, okay, yes. And actually throughout history, I know I mentioned that Pinochet outlawed certain instruments to try and kill the Nuevo Canción movement, but throughout history, authorities have fought back in just this way. They pass legislation, or even if they don't pass legislation, they say that things are illegal. And so it is our responsibility as organizers and activists, and of course I believe as artists, to make sure that we train people and prepare people effectively for the repercussions of our actions. So if it means that people need nonviolent direct action training, preparation for potential arrest or jail time, or if it means that there is arrest potential for people who cannot afford to risk arrest, we need to make sure that those people are actually safe and don't engage in the behavior that will get them arrested. So we can actively fight laws that are on the books or fight regulations that are on the books. We spend quite a lot of time doing that sometimes, or we can do our best to work around them and to support those of us who face the repercussions of breaking laws or regulations.
Okay, our next question comes from Natalie, who asks, what do you think will be the impact of new technologies in the use of traditional arts, such as theater or puppets, for cultural resistance? And how do you think we can encourage conscious uses of new media, including iPhones and other mobile devices, to help resistance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here I am doing this webinar, right? And as I said in the beginning, I really don't do lectures, but I did embrace this opportunity because of the ability to reach a lot of people. So I think that new technology is definitely part of the work that we have to do. And in fact, I think, we ourselves as a group need to write some mores or come up with a framework for how we use iPhones or flip cams in the work that we do. And it can be so effective. Right now, there's so much information out there. If you Google, any of these protests, you'll find incredible amounts of images and videos and music to accompany this. Basically, there's now soundtracks for every revolution, right? And so I think that I'm okay with the new tech. I do think that it won't kill the old tech completely ever, because there's something about individualized involvement in creation of art and the individualized involvement in the cultural work that we do, whether it's cooking food, sewing clothes, or building giant puppets. There is a camaraderie and a space for consciousness raising, and then a way to gain trust and build teams by working together through these traditional methods that I think will never go away and will always be valuable. And I do think, interestingly, I've also been thinking a little bit about, I recommend that people do sort of a strategic cultural assessment. What are the cultural pieces of our struggle that we can harness in trying to win our demands? And often, for example, I've been part of anti-war peace movement for many years, and many times people accuse that movement of being Luddites, of not embracing new technology. And I think that one of the things that we can learn from the ACT UP movement or the feminist art movement is their complete embracing of the new technologies of the time, using the public relations avenues and the cutting-edge media, shocking graphics to get in your face with the demands of healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that some groups need to be challenged to use popular culture or current technology more effectively in the work that they do. And some groups, of course, could benefit by using some of the older and more, traditional methods. So it's really a great thing to think about when we're planning campaigns.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. This one comes from Michael, who asked you to talk about how the approach of smart memes helps shine light on the strategic use of the arts.
So just so in case people don't know what a meme is actually an idea that self-replicates. And the idea coming from is a derivative of the word gene, right? A self-replicating biologic piece. This is a self-replicating, hopefully, thought bomb or thought idea. And so if you look at how society has changed or how society changes, there are people who believe that storytelling in particular is a gift, a way to connect with people and a way to move our work forward. And through a meme or a story that reaches people, it should, if we do our work correctly in our strategy sessions and our understanding of how messaging works, we are able to identify memes or things that resonate and self-replicate with different groups. So that would mean logos or puppets or images or song lines that reach people where they are and move them to think and incorporate the ideas of change into the work that they do. And it's definitely one of the big challenges for groups and people trying to figure out where to take their campaigns and what to focus on so that they can be effective in harnessing whichever methodology of art and cultural resistance that they choose.
All right, so unfortunately it looks like we are out of time, just gone a bit over, and I do apologize. I see there's quite a few excellent questions still left over we haven't had time to get to, but I will be sure to forward those to Nadine, and Nadine, if you have the time, maybe you can respond to those people who have those questions.
Great. Thank you very much for this chance to talk to people.
Yes, and if anyone else has any additional questions that they think of after the presentation, you can send an email to webinar@nonviolent-conflict.org, and we'll also forward those to Nadine. And a couple people were asking if this will be recorded. Yes, it will. We're going to upload it to our website, and we'll also do a bit of audio editing so that it's a bit easier to hear. So that in case you missed any of those parts, you can go back. I'll recommend to a friend or colleague if you think they'd be interested so they can listen as well. And that'll be uploaded to our website at www.nonviolent-conflict.org. And as Nadine mentioned, we'll upload some of those resources for cultural resistance that she had mentioned before, some links and whatever else she sends to me. And finally, feel free to come find us on Facebook, or you can follow us on Twitter at NVConflict. And thanks again, Nadine, so much for your presentation. Were there any final comments or anything else you wanted to mention?
I just really appreciated this time, and I really encourage people to jump in wherever you're at. If you're an artist, if you're an organizer, if you're an activist, jump in and think about integrating some form of cultural work or arts into your planning, your organizing, and particularly into your actions, and the benefits will be wonderful.
So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Be sure to keep an eye out for upcoming webinars, which we'll announce on our website. And thank you very, very much, Nadine, and have a great day, everyone.